You're 19 years old. You're thousands of miles from home, huddled in a foxhole with your best friends. The enemy is everywhere. Bullets are flying. Explosions rock the ground beneath you. And then, in one horrifying moment, you see it. A grenade lands in the middle of your position. You have maybe 2 seconds before it detonates. Everyone you love is about to die. What would you do? Most of us would freeze. Some would run. But a few extraordinary souls would do the unthinkable. They would throw themselves onto that grenade, using their own body as a shield to absorb the blast. This is the story of one such man. His name was Jack Lucas. He was just 14 years old when he forged his mother's signature to join the Marines. He was 17 when he jumped on not one, but 2 grenades to save his fellow soldiers during the Battle of Iwo Jima. And what happened next? He survived. Against every law of physics, every medical possibility, every reasonable expectation, he lived. But survival was just the beginning of his story. This is a tale of courage that defies belief, suffering that tests the limits of human endurance, and a life forever marked by one impossible choice. This is the story of the youngest Medal of Honor recipient in American history, and the demons he carried long after the war ended. Jacqueline Harold Lucas was born on February 14, 1928, in Plymouth, North Carolina. Valentine's Day baby. From his earliest memories, Jack was different. Not content, not patient, not willing to sit on the sidelines while history happened around him. When Pearl Harbor was bombed on December 7, 1941, Jack was 13 years old. He watched newsreels at the local theater showing the Arizona sinking, the fires, the chaos. He listened to President Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech on the radio. And, while other boys his age talked about playing soldier, Jack decided he would become one. There was just one problem. You had to be 17 to enlist in the Marines, even with parental consent. Jack was 5 years too young. So, he did what any determined teenager would do. He committed fraud. In August 1942, at just 14 years old, Jack forged his mother's signature on the enlistment papers. He was tall for his age, mature-looking, and confident enough to lie convincingly about his birth date. The recruiters didn't ask too many questions. This was wartime. America needed bodies, and here was a strong, healthy young man eager to serve. Jack Lucas became a United States Marine. His mother, when she found out, was devastated. She tried to get him discharged, explaining to the authorities that her son was only 14. But Jack was stubborn. He begged her to let him stay. He argued that he was already trained, already a Marine. What would happen to him if they kicked him out? He'd be branded a deserter? A fraud? Eventually, worn down by her son's determination and the military's reluctance to admit their mistake, she relented. For the next 2 years, Jack trained. He was assigned to guard duty in Hawaii, safe, far from combat, exactly where the military wanted to keep such a young recruit. But Jack didn't join the Marines to stand guard. He joined to fight. And when he learned that his unit was shipping out to combat in early 1945 and that he wasn't going with them, something inside him snapped. On January 5th, 1945, Private Jack Lucas went AWOL. He stowed away on the USS Duel, a troop transport ship heading for the invasion of Iwo Jima. For days, he hid below decks, living on stolen food, avoiding detection. It wasn't until the ship was too far from port to turn back that he finally revealed himself to the officers. They were furious. Going AWOL in wartime was a court-martial offense. Stowing away on a combat vessel was even worse. But what could they do? They couldn't turn the ship around for one foolish kid. They were headed for one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. So they assigned him to a rifle platoon and told him he'd face charges if they got back. Jack Lucas had gotten his wish. He was going to war. He was 17 years old. February 19th, 1945. The island of Iwo Jima is barely 8 square miles of volcanic ash and rock. From the air, it looks like a pork chop, That's what the Marines called it. Mount Suribachi rises from the southern tip, a dormant volcano that dominates the landscape. The island seems insignificant, barely worth noticing, but Iwo Jima is strategic. It's 660 miles from Tokyo, close enough for American fighters to escort bombers to mainland Japan. It has 2 operational airfields, with a 3rd under construction. The Japanese know that losing Iwo Jima means losing their ability to defend the homeland. They've spent months fortifying it, turning the entire island into a fortress. 21,000 Japanese soldiers are dug into the volcanic rock. They've built 11 miles of tunnels connecting pillboxes, bunkers, and artillery positions. They've placed machine guns in caves with interlocking fields of fire. They've buried landmines and strung barbed wire. And they've made a pact. No surrender, no retreat. They will fight until every last man is dead. The Americans know it's going to be bad, but they don't know it will become the only battle in the Pacific War where American casualties exceed Japanese casualties. They don't know that in the next 36 days, nearly 7,000 Americans will die and another 20,000 will be wounded. They don't know they're sailing into one of the most savage battles in human history. Jack Lucas hits the beach on D-Day. His unit is part of the first wave. The landing craft's ramp drops, and suddenly, the air is filled with the sound of machine gun fire, artillery, and screaming. Men fall into the water, wounded or dead before they even reach the shore. Others make it to the beach only to find there's no cover, just loose volcanic sand that makes running nearly impossible and provides no protection from bullets. Jack's first taste of combat is chaos incarnate. The beach is a killing field. Bodies lie everywhere. Wounded men cry for medics. Officers shout orders that can barely be heard over the explosions. And the sand, the terrible black sand that gets into everything, weapons, wounds, mouths, eyes, doesn't freeze. He doesn't panic. He moves forward with his unit, firing at positions he can barely see, diving for whatever minimal cover exists. By the end of the first day, his unit has advanced only a few hundred yards inland. The casualties are staggering, but they're alive, and they're holding ground. The next day, February 20th, Jack's unit pushes forward again. Their objective is to advance toward the island's airfields, moving through a landscape of ravines, ridges, and pillboxes. Every yard is contested. Japanese soldiers emerge from tunnels behind American lines, shooting them in the back. Snipers pick off anyone who raises their head. Artillery rains down constantly. It's during this advance that Jack finds himself separated from his unit. In the confusion of combat, he and 3 other Marines, Private First Class Lionel Cox, Private First Class Glenn Gray, and Corporal Robert Dunlap, end up in a ravine ahead of the main American lines. They're trying to locate Japanese positions when they realize they've walked into a trap. Japanese soldiers are on all sides. The 4 Marines take cover in a shallow trench barely 3 feet deep. They're pinned down, taking fire from multiple directions. They return fire, but they're outnumbered and outpositioned. This is how men die in war, not in dramatic charges or heroic last stands, but trapped in holes, slowly running out of ammunition, waiting for the inevitable. And then it happens. Japanese soldier appears on the ridge above them and throws 2 grenades into the trench. They land in the sand between the 4 Marines, both fuses burning, both seconds from exploding. In that frozen moment, time seems to stop. Jack Lucas looks at the grenades. He looks at his 3 companions, and he makes his choice. He throws himself forward, covering both grenades with his body. There's a phrase in the military, falling on a grenade. It's the ultimate act of self-sacrifice, the ultimate expression of the warrior code, that you value your brother's lives more than your own. It's also, almost invariably, fatal. A hand grenade contains roughly 6.5 ounces of explosive material. When it detonates, It produces a blast wave powerful enough to rupture organs and a spray of shrapnel moving at thousands of feet per second. If you're standing 5 yards away, you might survive with severe injuries. If you're lying directly on top of it, physics says you cannot survive. The blast will tear through your body with nothing to stop it. Jack Lucas understood this. He knew he was committing suicide. But in that split second, it was the only thing that made sense. 3 men would live. 1 would die. Simple mathematics. The first grenade exploded. The force of the blast drove Jack's body into the volcanic sand. Shrapnel tore through his body, his chest, his arms, his face. The concussion was so powerful that it should have liquefied his internal organs. By every measure, by every law of combat medicine, Jack Lucas died in that trench. But he didn't. The second grenade rolled slightly as Jack landed on it. When it exploded, most of the force was directed downward, into the sand, rather than through Jack's body. This tiny detail, a few inches of displacement, meant the difference between certain death and almost certain death. Jack's 3 companions were shielded from the blasts. They suffered minor shrapnel wounds and hearing damage, but they survived. Jack absorbed the vast majority of both explosions. When the smoke cleared and they looked at his body, they assumed he was dead. No one could survive that. But then, Jack moved. He was unconscious, bleeding from dozens of wounds, his body broken and mangled, but alive. His companions screamed for a corpsman. Navy medic William Carney reached the trench and stared in disbelief. This Marine should be dead. His chest was a mess of shrapnel wounds. His left arm was nearly severed. His face was torn open. But he had a pulse. Carney and other medics worked frantically. They applied bandages, injected morphine, tried to stabilize Jack enough to move him. Under constant enemy fire, they carried him back through the ravines to a casualty collection point. From there, he was evacuated to the beach, loaded onto an amphibious vehicle, and transported to a hospital ship offshore. The doctors on the hospital ship gave Jack little chance of surviving. He'd lost massive amounts of blood. Shrapnel was embedded throughout his body, more than 250 pieces in total. Some were lodged in his spine, his lungs, his liver. Operated immediately, removing what they could, but dozens of pieces were too deep, too close to vital organs. They'd remain in his body for the rest of his life. Jack drifted in and out of consciousness for days. When he finally woke up, really woke up, he was on a hospital ship bound for Guam. He'd been at Iwo Jima for less than 48 hours. The battle would rage for another month. The doctors told him he'd never walk again. The damage to his spine and legs was too severe. He'd be in a wheelchair for life, assuming the infections didn't kill him first. Combat wounds in that era often became fatally infected. Antibiotics existed but weren't always effective, and Jack's wounds were catastrophic. But Jack Lucas, the kid who'd forged his way into the Marines at 14, who'd stowed away on a combat vessel, who'd thrown himself on 2 grenades, wasn't interested in what doctors said was impossible. He would walk again. He would recover. He would survive. It would take 21 surgeries and 2.5 years of hospitalization, but he would prove them all wrong. On October 5th, 1945, 7 months after the Battle of Iwo Jima, President Harry Truman presented the Medal of Honor to Jack Lucas at the White House. At 17 years old, Jack became the youngest Marine and the youngest service member since the Civil War to receive America's highest military decoration. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Private First Class." Lucas, by his inspiring action and valiant spirit of self-sacrifice, was directly responsible for saving the lives of his 2 companions and enabled his platoon to accomplish its mission. Standing before the president, his body still broken and healing, Jack Lucas was a national hero. Newspapers across America ran his photograph. Radio shows told his story. He appeared in newsreels at movie theaters. Strangers stopped him on the street to shake his hand, to thank him, to call him a hero. But Jack didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a kid who'd nearly died. He felt the constant pain from the shrapnel still lodged in his body. He woke up screaming from nightmares about the trench, the grenades, the explosions. He saw the faces of the men who died around him on Iwo Jima, and he carried a guilt that no medal could erase, guilt that he'd survived when so many others hadn't. This is the part of the hero's story that doesn't make it into the newsreels, the aftermath, the cost of survival. Jack spent the next 2 years in and out of military hospitals. Surgery after surgery to remove shrapnel, repair damage, address complications. He endured pain that would have broken most people. Physical therapy was agonizing, relearning to walk, to use his damaged arm, to function with a body that had been literally torn apart. He was discharged from the Marines in 1945, medically retired with a 100% disability rating. He was 18 years old. Most teenagers are finishing high school, going to prom, planning for college. Jack was a disabled combat veteran with a Medal of Honor and a body full of metal fragments. He tried to build a normal life. He went back to school, eventually earning his high school diploma and then attending college. He got married. He started a business. From the outside, it looked like Jack Lucas had successfully transitioned to civilian life, but the war never left him. The nightmares continued. The pain continued. The memories of Iwo Jima haunted him. He started drinking to cope. His marriage fell apart. His business failed. By the 1960s, Jack was struggling with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though the term didn't exist yet. Back then, they called it combat fatigue or shell shock, and the treatment options were limited. Jack became reclusive. He moved frequently, struggling to hold jobs, to maintain relationships, to find peace. The young man who'd been so brave, so determined, so selfless in combat, was now lost in civilian life. He wrestled with depression, with anger, with a sense that he should have died in that trench and didn't know how to live with the fact that he hadn't. This went on for years, decades even. Jack Lucas, Medal of Honor recipient, hero of Iwo Jima, lived a quiet, often painful existence, largely forgotten by a nation that had once celebrated him. But Jack was a survivor. He'd survived the impossible once before. And slowly, painfully, he began to survive the aftermath too. He found help through veterans organizations. He connected with other combat veterans who understood what he was going through. He began speaking publicly about his experiences, not just the moment of heroism, but the struggle that followed. In the 1990s, as World War II veterans aged and their stories became precious historical records, Jack began to embrace his role as a witness to history. He attended Iwo Jima reunions. He spoke at schools. He participated in documentaries. He found purpose in ensuring that the story of Iwo Jima and the 6,821 Americans who died there would not be forgotten. He remarried and found happiness with his wife, Ruby. They lived in Mississippi, where Jack spent his later years as something he'd never been in his youth, at peace. Jack Lucas died on June 5, 2008, at the age of 80. He'd lived 63 years beyond the moment that should have killed him. 63 years of pain, struggle, triumph, and ultimately, redemption. At his funeral, military honor guards carried his flag-draped coffin. Marines in dress blues saluted. Taps played. He was buried with full military honors as befitting a Medal of Honor recipient. But more importantly, he was mourned by a family who loved him, by fellow veterans who understood him, and by a grateful nation that had never quite forgotten his sacrifice. The three men whose lives Jack saved that day in the trench, Lionel Cox, Glenn Gray, and Robert Dunlap, all survived the war. They went home to their families, built careers, had children and grandchildren. Because of Jack's choice, their family trees continued. Today, there are dozens of people alive, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, who exist only because Jack Lucas threw himself on those grenades. That's the real measure of his sacrifice. Not the medal, not the ceremony, not the newspaper headlines. It's the lives that continued because his nearly ended. It's the families that exist because he chose to die so others could live. But Jack's story is also a stark reminder of the cost of heroism. We celebrate the moment of courage, the jump onto the grenade. But we often forget the aftermath, the surgeries, the pain, the nightmares, the decades of struggling with trauma, the marriages that fail, the jobs that don't work out, the quiet desperation of trying to be normal after experiencing something fundamentally abnormal. Jack Lucas was a hero, undeniably, objectively, factually a hero. But he was also a human being who paid an enormous price for that moment of selflessness. And his story should remind us that we owe our heroes more than medals and ceremonies. We owe them support, understanding, and care, not just in the immediate aftermath of their sacrifice, but for all the years that follow. Today, if you visit the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Virginia, you can see Jack's Medal of Honor on display. You can read his citation. You can see photographs of him at 17, standing with President Truman, looking impossibly young to have done something so impossibly brave. But the full story, the story of the frightened boy who became a Marine, who threw himself on grenades, who survived against all odds, who struggled for decades with the aftermath, and who ultimately found peace. That story is harder to see in a museum display. That story requires understanding that heroism is complex, that courage has a cost, that survival is sometimes the hardest part. Jack Lucas made a choice in a split second that echoed through decades. He chose his brothers over himself. He chose their futures over his own. And he lived with that choice and its consequences for the rest of his long, complicated, ultimately meaningful life. When we tell stories of heroes, we often focus on the dramatic moment, the grenade, the explosion, the survival. But the real story is what comes after. It's the 63 years of living with pain, with memories, with the knowledge that you did something impossible and then had to figure out how to be human afterward. Jack Lucas did something that should have been impossible. He threw himself on 2 grenades and lived. But perhaps his greater achievement was what he did in the decades that followed. He survived, he endured, he found purpose, he loved and was loved. He turned his moment of sacrifice into a lifetime of meaning. And in the end, isn't that what we all hope to do? To make our brief time on this earth matter? To do something that echoes beyond our own life? To leave the world better than we found it? Jack Lucas did that. In a trench on Iwo Jima, in a moment of ultimate selflessness, he changed the world. And then he spent the rest of his life learning how to live in the world he'd changed. That's the story that will break you. Not just the courage of jumping on a grenade, but the courage of surviving it, the courage of living with it, the courage of finding meaning in the aftermath. Jack Lucas was 17 years old when he became a hero. He was 80 when he died. And every single day in between was part of his story, the most important part. The part that teaches us that heroism isn't just about the moment of sacrifice. It's about what you do with all the moments that come after. Rest in peace, Jack. You earned it. This has been the story of Jack Lucas, the youngest Medal of Honor recipient in American history, and the long journey that followed his impossible act of courage. Thank you for watching.